In 1957, a shipping clerk in New Jersey started copying the exact moves his wealthy boss made with every paycheck, not the stock tips, the boring habits. When he died in 2003, he left behind a portfolio worth $2.3 million and a note that said, "The rich never explain this part on purpose." The habit he copied is number 12 on this list. Number 22 used to be printed inside every bank passbook until banks realized it cost them money. And number 1 is the single habit private wealth managers still will not put in writing. These 25 habits were never illegal, never hidden in a vault, just quietly left out of the conversation. Before we begin, hit subscribe, because the difference between wealthy and comfortable often comes down to exactly what is on this list. Number 25. Paying yourself first before a single bill goes out. Wealthy families have treated savings as a fixed cost since before income tax existed. Not what is left over after spending, the very first withdrawal, treated with the same seriousness as rent. A steel executive in the 1920s in Pittsburgh instructed his bank to automatically move 15% of every deposit into a separate account before he ever saw a statement. Middle-class advice has always run the opposite direction. Budget your bills first, save whatever remains. The math guarantees the wealthy accumulate, and everyone else does not, because there is rarely anything left at the end of the month. The habit costs nothing to copy, and nobody teaches it because there is no product to sell around it. Number 24. Treating debt as a tool, not a trap. Wealthy households have never viewed all debt equally. A mortgage on an appreciating property or a loan used to buy a cash-flowing asset was considered productive leverage, while debt used to buy a depreciating car or a vacation was considered a mistake. Financial institutions profit more when the middle class treats every form of borrowing the same way, since confusion keeps people paying interest on consumption instead of using credit to acquire income-producing assets. The distinction between good debt and bad debt is centuries old, but it rarely appears in mainstream personal finance advice because clarity reduces borrowing across the board, including the profitable kind for the bank. Number 23. Owning the thing that produces the product, not just buying the product. A wealthy farmer in the 1930s did not simply buy milk, he owned the cow. Families with capital have historically bought the asset behind a recurring expense whenever the math allowed it. A laundromat instead of a laundry bill, a rental property instead of a rent payment. The habit requires upfront capital. Most households never accumulate because they never adopted habit 25 in the first place, which is precisely why these habits compound on each other rather than functioning as isolated tips. Number 22. Reading every financial document line by line before signing. Passbooks issued by banks through the mid-20th century actually printed short explanations of compound interest and fee structures directly inside the cover, assuming the account holder would read them. Wealthy families raise their children to review contracts, loan terms, and account disclosures personally rather than trusting a banker's summary. That habit alone prevented generations of consumers from unknowingly paying garnishee fees, prepayment penalties, and compounding interest structures that quietly worked against them. Modern account agreements run dozens of pages, specifically because financial institutions know most customers will not read past the first paragraph. Number 21. Using accountants as strategists, not just tax preparers. A wealthy manufacturer in 1948 met with his accountant quarterly, not once a year in April. The conversation covered structuring purchases, timing income, and legally minimizing taxable events before they happened, rather than reporting them after the fact. Middle-class households have historically treated the accountant as someone who fills out a form once annually, missing the entire strategic function that wealth actually depends on. The tax code has never been secret, but proactive use of it has always been a habit of access and mindset rather than legality. Number 20. Buying insurance to protect assets, not to avoid thinking about risk. Wealthy families historically insured specific, quantifiable risks: a warehouse, a shipment, a key employee whose death would cripple the business, and self-insured everything else by maintaining cash reserves. Middle-class households have often been sold blanket insurance policies covering minor, affordable risks while remaining dangerously underinsured against the catastrophic ones. The difference is not the amount spent on insurance, but the precision of what it protects, a distinction that generates far less commission for an agent than simply selling broad coverage. First pattern break. Everything up to this point has been about protecting and structuring what already exists. The next several habits explain how wealth actually multiplies, and this is where the gap between the wealthy and everyone else widens fastest, because these habits require patience rather than income. Number 19. Reinvesting profits instead of spending them. A dry goods store owner in 1910 who earned an extra $400 in a good season did not take a vacation. He bought more inventory or expanded the shelving. Wealthy operators have treated business profit as fuel for the next cycle of growth, rather than a reward to be consumed immediately. The habit feels counterintuitive because it delays gratification indefinitely. But compounding only works on capital that stays invested. Families who broke this discipline, even occasionally spending a windfall instead of redeploying it, consistently fell behind families who did not. Number 18. Buying assets that generate income during a recession. Wealthy families have historically viewed economic downturns as buying opportunities, rather than events to fear. When asset prices fell during the 1930s, families with cash reserves acquired real estate, businesses, and stock at prices that would look absurd within a decade. The habit required maintaining liquid capital, specifically for downturns, a reserve most households spend down during good times rather than preserving for bad ones. The wealthy were not smarter about timing markets. They simply had dry powder available when everyone else was forced to sell. Number 17. Negotiating everything as a matter of identity, not desperation. A wealthy buyer in any era has never treated a listed price as final, viewing negotiation as a normal part of any transaction rather than something embarrassing reserved for the financially strained. Sellers have always offered better terms to buyers who project confidence and patience, and wealthy families raised their children to negotiate reflexively on everything from real estate to car purchases to service contracts. The middle-class instinct to avoid appearing cheap by not negotiating costs households thousands of dollars annually that never gets recovered. Number 16. Using other people's money through leverage responsibly. Real estate fortunes built across the 20th century relied heavily on mortgaging a property at a low fixed rate, while the asset appreciated faster than the interest accrued. A landlord in 1965 could buy a building with 20% down, let tenants pay off the mortgage through rent, and end up owning an appreciated asset purchased mostly with borrowed capital. The strategy has never been secret, but it requires comfort with structured debt that most households were taught to fear entirely rather than understand selectively. Number 15. Keeping a portion of wealth outside the primary currency. Families who lived through currency devaluations in the early 20th century learned to hold a portion of their savings in hard assets, gold, land, or foreign currency, specifically to protect against inflation eroding cash value. Wealthy households have quietly maintained this diversification for generations, while middle-class savings accounts sat almost entirely in cash. Losing purchasing power every year, inflation outpaced the interest earned. The habit is not about predicting collapse. It is about never being fully exposed to a single currency's fate. Number 14. Treating time as the scarcest asset, not money. A wealthy industrialist in the 1920s paid other people to mow his lawn, manage his correspondence, and run his errands, not out of laziness, but because every hour he spent on a low-value task was an hour not spent finding the next deal. Households that equate frugality with doing everything themselves often lose more in missed opportunity than they save in avoided expense. The wealthy have always calculated the dollar value of an hour and outsourced anything worth less than that number. Number 13. Building relationships before needing them. A wealthy businessman cultivated his relationship with his banker for years before ever needing an emergency loan, so that when the request came, trust was already established. Middle-class households have historically approached financial institutions only in moments of need, arriving as strangers asking for favors rather than known quantities, asking for expected service. The habit of relationship banking, showing up, communicating, staying visible, has quietly determined who gets approved quickly and who gets scrutinized. Number 12. The coattail investing habit. This was the habit our shipping clerk used. Wealthy employees have long paid close attention to what their employers and executives personally invested in, reasoning that people with inside operational knowledge of an industry often made informed capital decisions within it. The clerk noticed his boss quietly buying shares in a supplier company years before it became a household name, and he bought a modest position alongside him. It required no special access, only attentiveness, and the willingness to act on an observation most co-workers dismissed as none of their business. Second pattern break. Here is what almost never gets said directly. None of the habits so far required a large starting income. They required attention, patience, and a willingness to delay comfort. The remaining habits explain how the wealthy protect and transfer what they have built, and this is where the class gap becomes generational rather than personal. Number 11. Teaching children to manage real money early, not allowance. Wealthy families historically gave children actual responsibility over meaningful sums. A clothing budget to manage for a season, a small investment account to track, rather than a symbolic weekly allowance spent on candy. The lesson was not about the dollar amount, but about experiencing the consequences of financial decisions before adulthood raised the stakes. Children who managed real budgets young made fewer catastrophic mistakes as adults, while children raised entirely insulated from financial consequence often struggled the moment they left home. Number 10. Structuring ownership to avoid probate delays. Wealthy families have used trusts, joint ownership structures, and beneficiary designations for generations specifically to move assets to heirs without the year-long court process of probate. Middle-class families frequently leave wills as their only estate planning document, unaware that a will still requires probate, while a properly structured trust often does not. The legal tools have always been available to anyone, but awareness of them has remained concentrated among households that could afford an estate attorney's first consultation. Number 9. Gifting during their lifetime instead of only at death. Wealthy grandparents have long used annual tax-free gift allowances to transfer money to children and grandchildren years before death, reducing the eventual taxable estate while allowing the family to see the money used and enjoyed. A middle-class family without knowledge of gift tax exclusions often waits until death to transfer everything at once, missing decades of compounding growth the recipient could have captured by receiving smaller amounts earlier. The rule has existed in the tax code for generations, quietly available to anyone who bothered to ask an accountant about it. Number 8. Buying quality once instead of cheap repeatedly. A wealthy household in 1955 bought a single well-made wool coat and wore it for 15 years, while a working-class household bought a cheaper coat every 3 years that cost nearly the same total over that same period. The habit is not about extravagance. It is about calculating cost per year of use rather than upfront price. Retailers profit enormously from consumers who never run that calculation, replacing the same category of item repeatedly at a total cost far higher than one durable purchase would have required. Number 7. Maintaining privacy about actual net worth. Wealthy families have historically avoided displaying wealth through visible spending, understanding that flaunting money invites both social friction and financial predators. The genuinely wealthy person driving a decade-old sedan was rarely poor. He simply understood that visible spending signals target, not success. Households chasing the appearance of wealth through visible consumption often spend themselves into the very financial fragility that real wealth is designed to avoid. Number 6. Using professional advisors as a team, not a single point of contact. Wealthy families have long maintained separate relationships with an accountant, an attorney, and an investment advisor, cross-checking advice rather than trusting a single person with the entire financial picture. Middle-class households frequently rely on one banker or one insurance agent for every financial decision, unaware that a single advisor's compensation structure may quietly bias the recommendations given. The habit of triangulating advice across professionals with different incentives has protected wealthy families from conflicts of interest that go entirely unnoticed by everyone else. Number 5. Holding assets long enough to reach favorable tax treatment. Wealthy investors have historically understood the difference between short-term and long-term capital gains taxation and structured their holding periods accordingly, sometimes waiting mere weeks to cross a threshold that dramatically reduced the tax owed on a sale. This single piece of timing knowledge, applied consistently across a lifetime of transactions, preserves a meaningfully larger share of investment gains than most households ever realize is available to them for free. Number 4. Building a network that shares opportunity before it becomes public. Wealthy families have historically gained access to private business deals, pre-IPO shares, and off-market real estate specifically because they belonged to social and professional circles where such opportunities got discussed before public listing. The advantage was never intelligence, it was proximity, being in rooms where information traveled before it became available to everyone else. Households outside those circles were not less capable. They were simply structurally excluded from the conversation entirely. Number 3. Funding education as an investment with a calculated return. Wealthy families historically evaluated education spending the way they evaluated any other investment, comparing the cost of a specific program against its realistic earning impact rather than pursuing credentials for prestige alone. A family with capital directed a child toward a specific trade or degree based on actual market demand, while families without that framework often financed education without ever running the return calculation, leaving debt with no corresponding income increase to offset it. Number 2. Insisting that money be discussed openly within the family. Wealthy households have historically talked about money at the dinner table, discussing investments, business decisions, and family financial goals in front of children old enough to understand them. Middle-class households have often treated money as a taboo subject, leaving children to enter adulthood with no working knowledge of how their own parents actually managed finances. The silence was rarely intentional cruelty. It was simply the absence of a habit that wealthy families practiced deliberately for generations. And finally, number 1, treating wealth as something to be transferred, not just accumulated. This is the habit private wealth managers rarely put in writing, because it requires admitting that individual accumulation is only half the picture. Wealthy families have historically planned every financial decision with the next generation in mind, structuring businesses, trusts, and investments to survive their own death rather than treating personal net worth as the finish line. A fortune built without a transfer plan frequently dissolves within 2 generations, a pattern documented across countless family businesses that thrived under a founder and collapsed under heirs who were never taught how any of it worked. The habit is not about the size of the estate, it is about the intention behind every decision made along the way. These 25 habits were never protected by law or locked behind a paywall. They were protected by silence, passed at dinner tables that most families never had, and reinforced by institutions that profit when the middle class does not ask questions. None of them require a 6-figure income to start. They require the willingness to treat money the way wealthy families always have, deliberately, patiently, and out loud. The question now is whether you keep treating this as trivia or whether you pick one habit and start this week.